I want to start off by welcoming everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our keynote talk for the Art and Race Matters exhibition. Before I introduce our curator, who will be helping to moderate the talk, I want to first start off with introducing myself. My name is Jaleesa Johnston, and I am programs lead, and I work in the Learning and Community Partnerships department at the museum. And I also want to do a visual description, which is something that we've been doing for our programs to sort of help. It's a tool for blind and low vision viewers that may not be able to see us very well. So it's to give them a sense of who we are, who the speakers are. So I am a Black woman wearing black rimmed glasses, silver hoop earrings, a red plaid shirt with curly black hair about shoulder length. I'm sitting in a blue room with two set of bookcases behind me. And that is my visual description. So, and then some housekeeping before we move forward. If you are watching this in the Zoom webinar, and as the talk gets going, if you have any questions, it's very important that you enter your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat. And if you are watching this on Facebook Live and you have a question, please enter your question into the chat box there, and I will be able to navigate or to move those from Facebook into the Q&A box on Zoom. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Grace Kook-Anderson, the Arlene and Harold Schnitzer Curator of Northwest Art, who will be talking a bit more about the program and introducing our speaker.
Great, thanks, Jaleesa. Hi, everyone. I'll give a visual description of myself. I am Asian. My hair is tied in a low ponytail. I have on round onyx earring studs. I have a turtleneck sweater that's oatmeal colored. Behind me are two bookshelves. There's a abandoned row machine leaning against the wall there, and a couch and a lamp that's lit. Anyways, that's my description. And I just want to thank you all so much for joining us today, for coming together on this Sunday and being here. And I'd like to also thank our sponsors, Cheryl and Rena Tonkin, and Marv Tonkin Leasing Company in memory of Alan Barron Tonkin. Thank you so much for making programs like this happen, and our Northwest Art Council at the Portland Art Museum. I'd also like to provide a land acknowledgement at this time. The Portland Art Museum recognizes and honors the Indigenous peoples of this region, on whose ancestral lands this museum now stands. These include the Willamette, Tumwater, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, and Watlala Chinook peoples, and the Tualatin Kalapuya, who today are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and many other Native communities who made their homes along the Columbia River. We also want to recognize that Portland today is a community of many diverse Native peoples who continue to live and work here. We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities, past, present, future, and are grateful for their ongoing and vibrant presence. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Erin Christovale. I was really happy to hear a lunchtime lecture a colleague had pointed out to me, and Erin at that time was speaking particularly about Robert Colescott's series. I think it was The Knowledge of the Past is the Key to the Future. And it's one of the most, I think, complicated compositions and so many layerings in that work. So today, I'm so pleased to have Erin here with us to be able to really do a deep dive into two particular bodies of work. And I'm so glad that we can kind of all spend this time together. Erin Christovale is the Associate Curator at the Hammer Museum. Together with Hammer Museum Senior Curator Anne Elgood, Christovale curated the museum's fourth Made in LA biennial in 2018. She also leads Black Radical Imagination, an experimental film program she co-founded with Amir George. Black Radical Imagination tours internationally and has screened at MoMA PS1, Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, and the Museo Taller Jose Clemente Orozco, among other spaces. Christovale is best known for her work on identity, race, and historical legacy. And before I pass it on to Erin, I'd like to remind you all again to please participate with Q&A at the end. Type in your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, and we look forward to your engagement. So Erin, I'll pass it on to you now. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Happy Sunday. One of the last Sundays of a very tough year. So I'm thankful to be closing out this year talking about one of the painters and artists I adore most in this world, Robert Colescott. I just want to thank Grace, Stephanie, and Jaleesa for really working through this with me to assure that this could happen. I think you know, we had a very long conversation about what we could talk about today. And, you know, I think that this show, this retrospective is so important because, you know, Colescott, I think, like, you know, many artists, specifically Black American artists, had sort of been lost to history, I think, for a brief moment. And it was really through, you know, the scholarship of, you know, incredible curators like Lowry Stokes Sims and, you know, so many others who made this possible, that his legacy continues to live on. Not only that, you know, he is sort of a seminal American artist, in my opinion, and he has influenced so many artists. You know, to name a few, I can think of, you know, Kara Walker when it comes to his sense of satire and humor, or Henry Taylor when it comes to his use of color, or even Glenn Lagon when it comes to text. And so, you know, he has influenced so many artists, contemporary artists that we know and love now. And so I'm grateful that he is coming back into focus. Not only that, you know, I think Colescott is someone that, you know, through his sort of interrogation of the self and his own identity, he paints an incredible picture throughout the decades of American society, of the socio-political issues that we deal with daily, of the constructs of race and gender and class, and how these constructs affect our society. And so it's incredible to look at a work of his, you know, from as early as the 1970s and still sort of feel a resonance as to what he is commenting about in some of these works. So when it came down to, you know, thinking through what I would talk about today, because I had way too many ideas. You know, I'm thankful that, you know, Grace, Stephanie, and Jaleesa helped me really narrow it down and pare it down to two, what I would argue, two very different aspects of his work. The first painting being Emergency Room, which is a painting that he did in 1989. And then the second work, which is actually not by him, it's a triptych, you know, a photograph triptych by Carrie Mae Weems. And it's called Framed by Modernism. And we'll talk a bit about that as well, which comes to, you know, which sort of comes to fore in the midst of the Venice Biennale, in which he is known to be the first Black American artist to have a solo show, even though Sam Gilliam technically was the first Black artist in a group show. So anyways, I think both of these aspects will really sort of get into what I feel to be sort of some of the core issues and conversations that Colescott has throughout the trajectory of his work. So thank you. So we'll move to the first slide here. So this is, this is a portrait of Colescott, and I really love this portrait because, he's framed by his own painting, as you can see here. I feel like, there have been several programs that have sort of spoken to who he is, so I won't really get into details, but, he was born in 1925 in Oakland, California. And this was after his parents intentionally migrated from New Orleans to Oakland in order for him and his brother to sort of have, better access to education. Both of his parents were, I think, a part of what we refer to as the Great Migration. And we're a part of, a community of people from both Louisiana and Texas who moved to the West Coast, specifically California. So, he was born in Oakland, and he sort of talks about his early sort of formative experiences with art. One of them being actually witnessing Diego Rivera, the Mexican muralist, paint one of his largest murals to date in San Francisco. So as a young person sort of witnessing this massive mural being painted by one of the greatest muralists of all time. And another is, Sergeant Johnson, who was a sculptor and who also worked with Colescott's dad on the railroads. And so Johnson's sculpture is largely, rooted in sort of depicting, Black people, sort of pointing to, I think, in every sort of class of everyday Black person. But also, I think what Sargent's sculptures really emphasize are these sort of what we'll refer to as cubist renderings of the body and the face, and these really gorgeous busts of people with these bright eyes. And so I talk about both of these influences just to sort of give you a larger picture of, how Colescott was navigating art. I think Diego Rivera was important for him because actually in the beginning, Colescott really was an abstract artist. He was really into abstraction. And it wasn't until he went and studied in Paris with Fernand Léger that he really got a sense of a more socialist and political understanding of what it meant to render people and to sort of be an artist that is a vessel to the community. I also mentioned Sergeant Johnson to think about this notion of Cubism, which I think is a notion that Colescott contends with in so much of his work, and sort of thinking through how does a young Black American artist grapple with the canon of painting, that is so overly determined by a Eurocentric canon. And thinking about how Cubism as an expression was actually something that was, appropriated from various African cultural objects. So this is Colescott here. So we'll go to the next thing here. So I'm going to start off with emergency room. And we're actually going to transfer to a short clip from a video, a short documentary that was made about Colescott called An American Original. And in his own words here, he's going to talk a bit about this painting here.
There's a painting that's called Emergency Room, and it's a big canvas. It's almost as big as I do, which is probably about 10 feet across. It becomes almost like a panoramic view of life in America. And the emergency room itself is a kind of allegorical theme, which gives me a chance to talk about, to use the allegory of the emergency room as in thinking about the whole culture, as a symbol of the whole culture and America, principally, in that we deal with problems only in expedient ways, and we find ourselves always in this great mess. And the mess, as you see it in the emergency room, which is the United States, in my thinking, has a lot to do with race relations and hierarchies, racial hierarchies. It has a lot to do with leadership and religion, and what part religion plays in the life and death of the country, and the cynicism of leadership and of the religious establishment, the way we deal with people who don't fit in to our system is to think of them as animals and lock them up. And so I have in one corner of that painting, there's a sequence of prison, and the prisoners are killing each other with knives and so forth. And they all look like apes, because that's the way they're considered. They're like animals. You lock up these fierce animals, and you don't much care what they do behind the bars, as long as they're behind the bars. And so the patient is one of the patients, or both of the patients that are represented in the painting, are already dead, you see, and everybody is so involved in the mechanics of the situation and trying to survive themselves, or trying to achieve their position and protect their positions in the hierarchy. They're too occupied to even realize that the patient's already dead, you see. So those are the kinds of things that come together. They're the kinds of things that I talk about, and at times I isolate one facet or another, or two facets in a single painting. In that particular painting, the emergency room, I tended to bring in the whole brew, and I think in looking at a painting like that, and there aren't many, but in looking at a painting like that is so inclusive, I think you could find almost all of the subjects that I deal with. I deal with sex, especially interracial sex. These are difficult topics in America still. I deal with social problems in the society, and let alone medicine. I even deal with medicine, and it's almost the one factor that is not even important, and yet it's principal to the painting. The painting through the medical allegory becomes about many things, but these are the things that I'm interested in, and it has to do with the society and the way people relate in this society, and the way I've always felt.
Okay, so that was, I think, a really great description, in his own words, of that painting, Emergency Room. And so I wanted just to reiterate a few things that he said, and in the meantime, we can bring the PowerPoint back up, which is, he said that this is one of the biggest paintings that he's ever done. It's at 10 feet. And I just thought that was really interesting because, throughout his lifetime, people asked him if he was interested in being a muralist, and he kind of pushed against that, but he would scale up for certain works to a degree. And I think in this case, to make a point, as he mentioned, this is a really all-encompassing piece that really portrays several of the issues that he works throughout his lifetime. And so this is, everything's here. And so, I think it's what I kind of want to do is I want to walk through these cast of characters that you see here, because there's so much happening in this work. And something that I really enjoy about his work, specifically when he gets into the 80s and the 90s, and there's a very distinct change in his painting style where he becomes more gestural, and he starts including these brighter, more lavish colors like the pinks and the purples that you see here. He's really sort of embarking on a new stage of his practice. And, this work comes after two very important series that he did in the 80s. One being The Bathers, which is a series in response to, The Bathers by Cézanne and Degas and, several other artists who've depicted, the sort of nudes, the women, in this sort of leisurely space. And then the second series is called Knowledge of the Past is the Key to the Future, which is a series that he did really sort of thinking through historical figures, in our history, specifically Black historical figures that have been overlooked. But, not only that, I think, something that he does, which I think is something that when we think about legacy, something that then Kerry James Marshall sort of picks up in his own regard, is wanting to insert the Black body and the Black story into, what we consider to be the masters or the masterpieces of painting or the classics. And so as he sort of pushed through both of those series, we then find him, I would consider, at his peak, when he is really, painting and when he is really sort of going for it. So, this painting here, I want to start with what I would consider one of the central figures here, which is this doctor. So there's a few things that you notice about this doctor. One is that he's not sort of wearing the traditional wear that we'd assume a doctor to be wearing, sort of surgical uniform. But in fact, he looks very casual. And even him sort of inserting this needle into what we're assuming to be a sort of pastor or reverend figure, as Colescott in the video talks about religion, even that is a very casual act. And, that, is sort of alarming, right? Sort of gives you some anxiety, which I think, the entire painting is very anxiety inducing, as it is in the emergency room. And there's such a casualness to the way that he is, doing this act. Not only that, but he's smoking a cigarette, which I think is so interesting because there's actually, a few characters, or I would just say mainly the doctor and the skeleton that you see here. And also there's sort of a security police monkey figure up at the top left who is also smoking a cigarette. And I think the cigarette motif is really important here because I think the cigarette is a symbol of Western society. It is a symbol of capitalism. It is a symbol of the way in which the systems around us work. It is a symbol of sort of quick, easy addiction, thinking about nicotine. And what's also just a little interesting tidbit is during this time, Philip Morris, which is a major tobacco company, was funding several, art exhibitions. And I don't know if Colescott was directly funded by them, but, there are several artists who sort of pushed against that during this time. So thinking about how, the cigarette is this sort of stand-in, if you will, for, what we could consider white supremacy, what we could consider a capitalist society, what we could consider this sort of oppressive, addictive object. So as he's smoking this cigarette in what we're supposed to be considering an emergency room, which just seems so bizarre, we notice that his face is white, but it has these sort of very luscious strokes of black. And so what I learned is that this is actually a Black man. He's a light-skinned Black man, and that actually everyone in this painting is considered to be a Black person. And there are a few exceptions, what I'll get into. And so once I learned this, it was really interesting, and it took me back to an interview that Colescott did for the Smithsonian. And he was talking a lot about why his parents moved to Oakland and, how that would help him and his brother receive a better education. So I want to just read a quick quote from that interview. He said, and in their thinking, and he's referring to his parents, it was going to be medicine or law or one of those other professions. I don't think they visualized, I know they didn't visualize the idea of me going to the university to study art, but it was the university. And so it had a very special obligation. And I think that the Black kids of my generation, almost all, felt if they came from educated families, they felt that they had the obligation to get a higher education. And in many cases, they left the state. They left the South in order to do their work, their college work. My aunt went to Oberlin to study music. My cousin went to Northwestern to study medicine. There was just a very powerful objective. And it was understood that if your family had reached a certain level in education, that you would get education. And there were no two ways about it. So, with that thought, sort of getting a historical framework of, Colescott's sort of how he was growing up, thinking about the Great Migration. And one of the main reasons for Black people leaving the South at that time was sort of to, get a better education, have more access to jobs. And, I think overall, assimilate into a middle class. And so the sort of pinnacle careers of this middle class, were, the Black folks who went into law, were the Black folks who went into medicine. And certainly not, the very few, the very brave that decided to go into art. And so I think he is really actually grappling with that, in that, this doctor that we see here who, we can assume is of a middle class, who we can assume is wealthy, has sort of made it, so to speak. But the way in which he's treating his patient is so lackluster. And there's clearly a lack of care. And there's clearly, even in his eyes, a lack of sort of understanding. And I think this points to a larger picture of a larger history in which, if we think about the American medical industrial complex and the history of how Black people have, sort of interfaced with that, in that, historically, Black people have been experimented on and operated on against their will, and have been sort of the ways in which major medical, moments and tools and even vaccines, as we think about this vaccine conversation that's starting right now around COVID, Black people have sort of been at the center of some of those experimentations. And so I think that's definitely a larger comment that we see here. When we see the nurse that's right behind the doctor, one thing that's interesting to note about her is she's actually not even wearing her nurse uniform. She's wearing sort of a patient's, cover up. And she is not looking at her own patient. She's actually looking at us, watching her. And as she is sort of looking at us, she is carelessly sort of sticking her fingers in the throat of this person that we see here. And I think this particular interaction for me actually brings up a lot of that medical imagery that I speak of. I just want to mention two sort of major medical experiments. One was the infamous Tuskegee Experiments, in which several Black men in 1932, the study started in 1932, and it initially involved 600 Black men, 400 of them had syphilis. This was experimenting on finding, a cure for syphilis. The study was conducted without the benefit of patients' informed consent. Researchers told the men they were being treated for bad blood, quote unquote. And in truth, these patients did not receive the proper treatment they needed to cure their illness. And in exchange for taking part in the study, the men received free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance. Although originally projected to last 6 months, the study actually went on for 40 years. So this is a major experiment that took place in Tuskegee, in which, as I mentioned, hundreds of Black men were sort of brought in, noting that they had bad blood, but not fully understanding that they were being experimented on to sort of find a cure for syphilis. And, as a result of that, several of these men, died early deaths, et cetera. Another sort of major moment I'll point out is that Marian Sims, which is a name you may or may not know, is a man who's known as, he's sort of the celebrated father of modern gynecology. Sims was actually, he was a gynecologist, and he practiced surgical techniques that made him famous on enslaved women. So the three main women that he operated on sort of several times were known as Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy. He performed 30 surgeries on Anarcha alone. And all of these surgeries he performed on her without anesthesia. He also invented the modern speculum and the Sims position for vaginal exams, both of which he first used on these women. So again, this man worked, experimented on 3 enslaved Black women, and is known as sort of one of the fathers of gynecology. And, he was experimenting on them without any sort of anesthesia. So, I think there's a larger conversation here around, once these cures and these vaccines and, these important medical moments happen, who are we celebrating? Who gets the praise for discovering these vaccines? And I think oftentimes what's lost are the people who have been experimented on to fully sort of understand these vaccines. So anyway, so I'll go back to the painting here. And what we also see in the nurse here, she is pushing against one of her patient's faces, which is a skeleton getting a blood transfusion. Again, this notion of bad blood. And the patient is also smoking a cigarette. But obviously this patient is a skeleton with a face. And I want to focus on his face here because I want to go back to this notion of Cubism, right? So I think in Colescott's sort of ongoing disruption, interrogation of Cubism, his goal, one of his main goals is really to sort of point back to, the Cubists appropriated this style of work from African cultural objects, from face masks, from, what they consider to be fetish objects. And what you see here is this sort of mask, you know? So the way that I'm reading it is that this is a very clear allusion to a sort of African mask. And the fact that, you know, when Colescott says in the video that everyone's so preoccupied with what they're doing that the patient is already dead, he is making a larger reference to art history in which he is saying Cubism has killed the sort of aesthetics of the African continent, you know? But not only that, that the African continent has now sort of picked up smoking. And for me, that sort of gestures towards a larger understanding of the sort of massive colonial aftermath of you know, the ways in which various societies and countries operate post-colonialism. So, you know, as he mentioned in the background here, we have a cast of monkeys that are fighting each other. You know, as he mentioned, you know, these are the people that our society thinks of as animals because they can't integrate into our society. So they just allow them to kill each other. They're also, as you can see, all sort of pushing against this woman figure here with the bikini top or the bra. And, you know, I think this is interesting because I think that this particular portion of the painting could potentially be misunderstood as Colescott maybe saying or, you know, alluding to the fact that like certain people are monkeys. But, you know, again, Colescott is really genius in sort of using a language and an identity that is given to us, right, to make a point. And so, as you can see, they're all sort of stabbing each other and fighting here. To the right of them is, I think, the most precarious figure in this painting, which is this sort of figure, this what we assume to be a woman with her golden hair, this brick-like woman who's sort of reclining. And if you can see into her eyes and her irises, she actually has two sort of skeletons in her irises. And as you can see behind her, there's these sort of brick stacks and the smoke spewing out. And I really took this as her sort of her, you know, the reason why she's included in this image is she is a representation of industrialism and thinking about, you know, the Industrial Revolution and how that was a major turning point in Western society, in which, you know, laborers learned to produce at massive scales and at expedient speeds. But when we think about that, when we think about industrialism, we have to think about who the laborers are, you know? And so I think so much about terms like environmental racism, in which, you know, so many of these major industrial sites are next to or are directly inside of Black communities across America. And so when we think about the long-term effects of industrialism and thinking about chemical residue and the day ins and day out of that exposure, we can think of a history in which so many Black communities, you know, are you know, constantly dealing with illness and the mistreatment, you know, of the ways in which, you know, these industrial spaces work. Not only that, that they are the laborers of these spaces, you know. And again, I think in the same way that he's making a comment on the medical industry and sort of the people who are erased in these major medical moments, he's also thinking about the everyday laborer and the way that that person is sort of erased in the process of producing, you know, whatever it is these sites are producing. And so there's that. And then, you know, there's so many other things. Obviously, the priest here, which I think is funny that the priest is watching TV. And not only that, but when you look at the TV, you see one of, the two sort of only white subjects in the painting of these two people, making love on TV. And so, it's this really interesting juxtaposition where, there's a priest who is sort of a representation of religion watching TV that has a clear representation of a sexual act. And so, again, this is him sort of enforcing the fact, implying that, all of these constructs, race, sex, religion, these systems that sort of fuel our society are actually implicit onto one another and are actually in sort of collusion with one another. Okay, so that is The Emergency Room, one of my favorite pieces of his. I mean, there's so many, points that I think I don't even have a chance to address because it's such a deep image. I guess one thing I'll note also is that when you look at all of the, what we would consider women in this painting, they're all sort of, either being attacked or confused or sort of like hiding behind someone. And so I think there's also a sort of commentary around, the ways in which a system like this, a country like this, affects women. And overall, the emergency room being this allegorical space and representation of a country, and thinking about the fact that, this is a country in which we don't deal with things until there's an emergency. And so a large part of why I wanted to talk about this piece in particular was just thinking about this year, thinking about COVID, thinking about the pandemic, thinking about the way in which this administration has dealt or not dealt with the pandemic, and thinking about all of the people who have suffered because of that. If you look at statistics of this year, of COVID, I think it's sort of obvious to note that some of the highest cases are, coming from Black communities, are coming from people of color. And so, when we think about a pandemic, it is sort of a way in which we can think through how our country works, who's privileged enough to sort of be able to truly stay at home, who is considered an essential worker and who has to be on the ground, and essentially whose lives are at risk day in and day out because of how this is handled. So we will move on to my next piece, the second piece, I guess. Okay. So before I get into Framed by Modernism by Carrie Mae Weems, I just wanted to briefly talk about Colescott's history of self-portraiture. What I love about the sort of trajectory of Colescott's work is that throughout his life, he has created these self-portraits of himself. And what I love most about that is in every self-portrait, he looks slightly different, but not only that, his skin tone is different. Sometimes he'll be light skinned, sometimes he'll be dark skinned, sometimes he'll have sort of a greenish color to his skin. And so I love how that for him is a sort of interjection into colorism, something that was a very personal, thing for him that he was grappling with throughout his life, and also gave him sort of agency to really embody his Blackness, to be a Black man. When, as a child, he was often taught by his parents to pass as white, as his brother, to the point where him and his brother actually had a falling out at a certain point because Colescott refused to solely pass as white. So oftentimes in his self-portraits, what you'll notice is that he is painting, so he is the painter, right? He's the subject, but he's still always the painter. There's still sort of that control that he has over the canvas and over the framing of the visual that we're witnessing. But not only that, he is oftentimes painting, you know, a nude woman. And so here's one of the classic images here. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, 1979. And as you can see, there's a woman here sort of exposing herself to him. And then he is sort of painting, you know, sort of classic Demoiselle Avignon piece that we see behind us. And so, of course, is a very direct reference to that. And so I think, you know, when Carrie Mae Weems was approached to take a portrait of him, she was very aware of the history of his work, very aware of the history of women in his work and his gaze upon women, and also very aware of sort of his relationship to not only white women, but Black women throughout the years. And so she was super interested in all of that and wanted to take all of that into account. So we will go to the next image here. Okay. So I want to give you a little bit of backstory behind this triptych here, because it's so fascinating to me. So this piece, Framing Modernism, that you see here, 1986. So Carrie Mae Weems first met Robert Colescott when she was actually a graduate student at UC San Diego studying photography. She was actually a student there alongside Lorna Simpson. And Colescott came and he did a lecture, and he also did several studio visits because UCSD was thinking of bringing him on as a full-time professor. So, you know, this is the first time that she met him, and, you know, she just recalls that being a really interesting moment where she was very confused by him, you know, very confused by his work, what he was trying to portray in his work. And, you know, I think ultimately how he viewed women. And so anyways, I think, you know, she sort of kept in contact with him because she was intrigued by this. You know, she saw his work as a challenge. And, you know, Colescott was invited to be the first Black artist to represent the United States in a solo exhibition at the Venice Biennale in 1997. At this time, he was 71 years old. And Miriam Roberts was the curator that brought him on. And so Miriam recalls, you know, having conversations with him leading up to this and realizing that someone needed to take his official portrait. And he decided that he wanted Carrie Mae Weems, at the time a young photographer, to be that person. And so he invited her out to his studio, which we see here. And Carrie clearly had very sort of different ideas as to how he would be depicted. Here's a quick quote from an interview that Carrie Mae Weems did with Lowry Stokes Sims around this particular work. Weems said, "I thought that as opposed to trying to figure out how to make really a work about Bob specifically, it might be more interesting to make work around the work that I make, which is based on the critical intersection between art and practice, men and women, gender and identity, and notions about the object and the subject, sort of bringing all of those ideas to bear on posing myself in a relationship to Bob." So I think, you know, what was interesting about this is that apparently when Weems showed up to his studio, when she was ready to take the photos, she said, "It's your turn to get naked." And she tried her hardest to convince him to, you know, pose in the nude. And he wouldn't do it. But he did sort of get down to what you see here, sort of like his undershirt, no shoes on. It's a very sort of casual look, sort of really raw look, portrait of the artist. And then, as you can see, there's 3 images here. We see Colescott in the forefront here, and we also see Weems looming in the background, fully nude. And as you can see, each piece reads the following: seduced by one another, yet bound by certain social conventions, you framed the likes of me, and I framed you. But we were both framed by modernism. And even though we knew better, we continued that time-honored tradition of the artist and his model. This piece, I think, really stood out to me because, first off, I think it's amazing that Weems, as a young photographer, is really sort of taking on this challenge of, how can one portray such a complicated artist, a complicated character, I think, in American art history, an artist whose work was often very difficult, an artist whose work was, I think, confusing, specifically for, in some cases, a Black audience who didn't, sort of understand or maybe want to rise to the occasion of the satire and the humor and the irony that he often portrayed in his work. And obviously an artist who not only was grappling with his own sort of personal identity, and dealing with, his skin tone and, the various ways in which he would be identified as both Black and not. But also an artist who, throughout the history of his paintings, who clearly had a very complicated relationship with women, and whose gaze, I think, at times we would consider was, maybe perhaps violent towards women. I think in considering all of this, Weems really, just sort of brings in all of that here. And so what you can see here is, Colescott, as you can see here, he's sort of putting his head down, which is interesting, right? Because if we think about that last painting that I just showed you, he's very sort of in control, he's stoic, he's doing his thing, he's painting. But this is the first time that we see him sort of down and out, sort of really grappling with the subject matter of his work. And he's sort of ashamed, as you can see here. Meanwhile, Weems looks very confident. She's posing, she's looking directly into the camera, and she is sort of holding court in a very different way in which he is, And so there's clearly a power dynamic that, I would argue for the first time is being switched, in which Weems, the woman, specifically the Black woman, has control over Colescott, has control over his studio, has control over his body of work. This is a very powerful gesture that she's making here. I think that she talks about framing, and I really want to get into that because, her claim is that they're both framed by modernism. And, when we think about the history of Colescott's work and his influences, there are so many modernist painters that have clearly influenced Colescott's work. Painters which, are largely male, largely white, and who over-determine the sort of canon of American art painting in general, the history of painting. So, there is a clear history of the female nude throughout this history of modernism, in which oftentimes the female nude clearly has no power. She has no agency. She is clearly an object, for the painter, and by way of that, for the audience to be consumed by. And so, this framing as a device is really interesting, because I think also when we think about the history of framing actual works, for me, that goes back to a very Eurocentric sensibility and thinking about these sort of classic or Renaissance paintings by the quote unquote masters. I think oftentimes the frames are sort of forgotten. And oftentimes these frames are gold encrusted, very elaborate. They're almost like artworks onto themselves, that sort of help I guess, provide some sort of value to the painting, that these paintings are valuable. They are contained by a golden frame. But what does it mean when two Black subjects are framed? They are actually contained. They are in a container that they can't escape. They do not have agency over the framing device, this Eurocentric framing device that they are trapped inside of. And then even though we know better, I think for her is sort of her way of thinking about her and him as Black subjects, that know better to sort of get in the business of these sort of conventions, that again are so overdetermined by these white painters. Why would we be implicit in this process when we know that historically we are not allowed to have any sort of agency in this space? We are not historicized in this space. And oftentimes when we are depicted in these spaces, we are depicted as the laborers, as the slaves, as, bodies and subjects that do not have any sort of power in these moments. So unfortunately, I'm going to try and wrap up this particular piece, and we can go into questions because I need to get my charger. And so I'll do that as we're getting ready for questions. But all this to say, I think this is a very powerful triptych. I think it was something that Colescott actually needed to sort of grapple with. And, he wasn't expecting this sort of rendering, but he eventually did sort of move forward with that, this being the official portrait. And it was actually hung in the pavilion amongst the rest of his works. And so it was a very sort of, I think, amazing way and strategy for Weems to think through, how do we contemporize, how do we grapple with Colescott and his practice? So that is it. Thank you. I will be right back as Grace queues us up for Q&A. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, Erin, this is so great. Thank you so much. There's so much to unpack, and I just love your read on the emergency room and also framed by modernism. And I can't wait to dig into those, but maybe we'll go back and revisit those earlier slides. And actually, we do have a fun first question about the banana that Colescott is holding in that first portrait. And I noticed that too. Typically, you might imagine him, he sits so regally in front of his painting, and the expectation is he would be holding a paintbrush, but we see him holding that banana. I don't know if you know anything more about it. It certainly speaks to his sense of humor. But do you have anything to add to that observation there?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I actually want to refer to a quote from that Smithsonian interview that I was telling you guys about. He says, if there's one thing that Black folks have, it's a sense of humor. And when they see the humor and the irony, of course, in all of the lyrics and the blues songs are often pretty rowdy, and present a rather base expression for Black arts. The guy that's supposed to be doing the old man on the mule, it's really funny. If you want to get acceptance within the community, just paint a couple of old men on mules. Um, Let me just get to another part here. And then some kind of heroic image, which is very far from the truth. The heroic image with where this guy looks like white with a suntan. Any sense of exaggeration could be questioned. What I want to say about all of this is, sure, I've seen all that and I've heard it all, but at the same time, right from the beginning, when I first started showing some of these works that were emphasized, a response of stereotyping right along I had plenty of encouragement. And I was surprised at the vigor of the responses, but sometimes they were, and it just didn't break down on racial lines. There are white people who were offended because they felt guilty because their people had created these images. And so it was threatening. But then there were white people who felt threatened by these paintings, which monumentalized these perceptions. So that's kind of a rambling sort of response from him, I think, about humor. But I think what he's getting at here is, as Grace mentioned, just sort of wanting. He needs, it is, I would argue, one of the most important strategies, I think, of Black folks to think about humor, this sort of notion of laugh before you cry. And so he wants to bring that humor into his work, as you see throughout some of his work. And this clear reference here to a banana, I think, even if we go back to the emergency painting and think about how, these people, these prison inmates are depicted as monkeys, and thinking about that as, a very violent and racial stereotype of Black people. I think he's actually playing off of that in this. And I think he is, again, just making things complicated and muddying them and making people grapple with that image and thinking about the history of that image. So.
Thanks, Erin. Can we visit the emergency room painting, and we'll tackle some of the questions there. So we have a question. I'm curious about what the disembodied white hands at the bottom represent. They appear to be clapping.
That's a great observation. I can't tell you that I fully understand what's going on there, but I think one thing we can all agree upon is that, these hands are clearly, as you said, disembodied and also bloody. And so for me, it sort of brings in this sort of colloquialism. They have blood on their hands, right? And so this is thinking about, this idea that they have committed a criminal act, that they have done something wrong. And I think in the context of this piece in the emergency room, when he is thinking about the systems within this country that sort of keep certain people oppressed and keep other people, privileged, I think he is sort of alluding to this fact that, the powers that be that are typically are thinking about white supremacy perhaps as one of those main powers. There is blood on their hands, as you see here.
Yeah, Erin, I was thinking about, I can't remember the exact, this is the one, his series of the pinup paintings, and this one, Miss Black Oakland. It's similar to the kind of hand gesture, but up on the top, you see these, these men's shoes, these very fancy, what are they called? Like wingtip shoes and slacks. You can kind of see like these are the people, they're faceless, but they're kind of controlling the whole system, the whole game of
Exactly.
beauty
Yeah.
contest.
Right.
So
This Wizard of Oz effect, right? Where
yeah,
like this figure that no one can actually see or have access to, who's controlling everything.
right, right. So yeah, the hands definitely kind of remind me of that. Um, so we have a comment here. Maybe Erin might comment on the doctor with the needle, and that Blacks have been questioned about the COVID vaccine, and only about 50% currently say they will take it.
Yeah, I can only sort of speak for myself here, but I think what you are sort of getting at is the history that I outlined about experimentation, about this sort of history of Black bodies being experimented on in this country. And so the very sort of fraught relationship that I think many Black people have with the medical industrial complex and the lack of trust, that's there. I even think about right now, like a story that sticks with me is thinking about, Serena Williams when she gave birth and how she noticed that there are complications that her doctor wasn't even noticing, and that she had to sort of step in the middle of her birthing process to point it out. And that was, sort of a major for her, because I think she would have been severely sort of injured, or, would have affected her birth. And so there's also this, history of Black women and the ways in which they're treated during pregnancy, in various hospitals. So this is, I think it's an ongoing issue in which I feel like, several Black communities just simply do not trust this complex and have had a very complicated and violent histories with it. And so I think there is this sort of um, questioning of this vaccine, and who will it help and why in that regard.
Mhm. I wonder, as this period of his painting, you talked about this kind of way of painting the skin, and it is so fascinating. In some ways, it's kind of it's not an easy painting to look at, just like the knowledge of the what is it? Knowledge of the
Knowledge of the past is a key to the future. Mm-hmm.
key to the future. Yeah, they're really difficult paintings to kind of look at because so much is sort of happening in them. But also his painting technique is really challenging too. The kind of that modeled skin, that dry on dry kind of brushing of the skin. And I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit more. I thought it was really interesting that you sort of surmised that most of the figures in this painting are Black folks.
Mm-hmm.
And can you talk a little bit more about that, and maybe more about that technique of that modeled painting, why that kind of comes at this point in his career?
Yeah, I think there is a few sort of things that are coming out of that. I think, um, and I'll talk briefly about this because I don't know much about this particular aspect, but I know that Colescott was very interested in his underpainting. And he uses this technique that's known as like the Venetian Glow. And oftentimes that's achieved by sort of, doing a sort of underpainting of this bright red color. And what that color does is when things are painted on top of it, it allows certain areas to glow and to pop, particularly in subjects. And so this was a technique that he often used, and I think sort of really comes out in the 80s and 90s here. But I think to speak towards these sort of very loose gestural strokes of how he is rendering skin tones and, even hair, like one of my favorite sort of accents in this piece is the nurse and her blue hair. I think I don't know. I really don't like know what his transition was in color, because it shows up for the first time in the Bather series, where he really like liberates himself from these sort of everyday colors, and people start having bright red hair, bright pink hair, blue hair, purple sort of washes over them. And I don't know, I love that. I mean, a part of me, and this is just me like totally pulling this out of nowhere, but I think a lot about where he was sort of located at the end of his life, and thinking about, he was in Tucson or Santa Fe. Let me actually just double check that. I want to say that he was in
I think it was Tucson.
Okay.
Yeah, I think.
Okay. And I want to just talk about like the landscape there, and thinking particularly about a sort of Southwest desert landscape that really lended itself to the sky. And thinking about, whenever I'm in that area, the epic hues and the theater of the sunset, and how all of these really incredible hues of purple and pink and red and even green come out. And maybe that in some way was an inspiration for him. But I think in another way, what he's doing here is he is really pointing to the fact that, Black people look all sorts of ways. We come in a variety of skin tones. And he, I think, was really pressed on, showing that through this, the fact that we can see here that, most of the characters or the subjects here are Black, but they all look very different. They all have very different skin tones. And I think that was a very important, in its sort of disruption for him, if you will, to sort of think about the ways in which Black subjects historically have been rendered in paintings.
This is so wonderful. I wish our exhibition was up for even longer, because there is just so much to unpack in all of his paintings. And I think with Colescott, he presents a lot of issues with us, but nothing is, it's less statements as it is posing the problems or posing the questions. I'd like to maybe go to the Framed by Modernism painting, and maybe if anyone in the audience have any questions, please do ask. One thing I am so fascinated by with this painting is the gaze of both the artists. And it's hard to tell in this triptych, but in that first one, Carrie Mae Weems is looking at Colescott, and it's this kind of hard gaze at Colescott. In the second one, her eyes are closed, and as you had pointed out, she's in this very kind of classical nude pose. And then in the third one, she looks down, and it's almost this kind of, it has almost a defeated gesture. And what I think is so interesting with Colescott, the fact that he was willing to portray himself as vulnerably as he did, even though it wasn't completely in the nude, but it is quite vulnerable. And where I think it's interesting with Colescott, as you point out in his various use of self-portraiture, he does implicate himself. He doesn't deny his sexism. He doesn't deny his issues with his own color, but he is very much implicated in his own paintings. But I wonder then, it's still a difficult, this triptych is still very difficult because it is more the question than a statement, in the sense that as it says, both are framed by modernism, but Colescott's gaze still looks outward in that middle triptych. He breaks that frame in some ways, whereas Carrie does not, even though she's the author. And I haven't come to any thoughts or resolutions, but it's one of those things that I've been kind of thinking about. I don't know if you have other thoughts or comments about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are such great observations. And I think so much of, sort of framing as a device is about gaze, and sort of also realizing that they're not the only two subjects that are implicated in this image. We as a viewer are the third subject. We are viewing them as they are viewing us. And so I think you can get into some really interesting existential questions of like, who is the viewer? Who is a sort of desired or assumed viewer that they are making this image for? Is it for the sort of constructs of modernism? Is it for, Black women, perhaps, as Carrie sort of takes the reins here as the author of this work? Is it for Colescott, in a way that he is being forced, to grapple with his work and the way that he has dealt with women in his work? Is it, there's so many questions around that. And so I love that, in a way, this image sort of is this ever evolving work. And when you're sort of constantly going back and forth between the subjects and, trying to sort of work these questions out. I want to say that even though she is sort of only looking at him, it's still very clear by her posture and her posing that she does sort of have this agency, that she is sort of dictating her likeness. And I love that, even though she sort of is caught into the frame, she doesn't have the opportunity in the way that Colescott does to look directly at the viewer. So she is still sort of, sort of overseen in a way by the male gaze. But she still is like, holding her own. And I think the other thing is perhaps we could even consider the camera, not only as a device, but as another subject in this work. And so, when we think about the history of the camera and the way, the sort of historical origins and like why Black subjects were depicted, I think there's something there. But the fact that this is not his camera, it is her camera. So it is by way an extension of her and her expression that, the camera is sort of doing the work for her of owning this image, of capturing. And so there's so much here. It's such a rich dialogue,
It's true. And I think what I do appreciate so much about Robert Colescott and Carrie Mae Weems is there is no black and white, like there is no allowance of coming to a resolution in any way. I think it's a lot of questions that are posed. We have a couple more questions. With that last triptych and the text on the bottom, the question is, can we talk about the phrase, even though we knew better? If you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I love that, because I feel like that is sort of this it's like a very intimate language that she's speaking. And I think that sort of strategy also lends itself to Colescott's work, in which, I really appreciate when I see work, I think particularly by Black artists, and there are certain phrases or certain gestures or certain things that are happening in the image where, you know, I understand them very deeply and intimately. And it's sort of an inside joke, you know, and there's something pleasurable in that, you know, the sort of, you know, assumed audience, perhaps a white audience, wouldn't immediately understand. You know, it's sort of this subversive gesture. And I think that's what she's doing here. She's saying, even though we knew better, you know, she's sort of saying that, you know, we as, you know, Black people, we have a very clear understanding of the history in which why, you know, how modernism has framed us, and the ways in which we've been depicted. So why are we playing into this? You know, why are we doing this? And I love that, you know, and she's sort of reprimanding him, you know, we know better, you know, but we're still here. So it's a very tongue-in-cheek moment of the text that I love.
And maybe we'll conclude with this last question. Did Weems ever talk about the selection of the Colescott work in the photo?
Oh, that's a really great question. I actually don't know. But from, let's see, I'm gonna have to do a little zoom in here to actually see which work that is, because I'm positive there's a sort of meaning behind that. Let's see, I would say, you know, probably yes. It looks like it is. Okay. So there's a figure on the right that it's not from the Bather series, but it's a figure that first shows up in the Bather series. And that's actually really important because the Bather series, in my opinion, was, I think, the first time that Black women in his work had a particular type of agency, where they weren't just sort of overdetermined by certain stereotypes and characteristics, but you know, he really was depicting Black women in all shapes and sizes and sort of celebrating the nude. And so I love that Weems is, you know, standing next to this figure. I think this is a later work, but again, it's important, I think, that she's next to this figure because she is responding to that particular moment. So.
Great, Erin. Thank you so much. I think we'll conclude here. Thanks for spending this extra time with us. And thanks to our participants who've stayed with us and for all your rich questions. This was really wonderful. I appreciate this so much. I actually feel so much more energized for my gloomy Sunday. And I hope you all are feeling the same way as well. I'm going to pass it on to Jaleesa before we conclude for any other final housekeeping moments. But thanks again, Erin.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you, Grace, and thank you, Erin, for a very awesome talk. And thank you to everybody who came out for this program. I wanted to just leave with one more note. So as Grace mentioned, the Colescott exhibition is closing. And we do have one more program before it closes. On December 10th, from 6:30 to 8, we have Perspectives on Colescott, Identity, Satire, and Politics with Broke Gravy. So this program is a roundtable discussion with Broke Gravy facilitating, and they've invited two guests, Siobhan Ball, who is the owner and founder of Dirty Radishes Travel Company, and Nishat Akhtar, who is the creative director at Instrument, and who is also an illustration artist. And they're going to be in discussion around Colescott's work, thinking through satire, politics, race, and gender, and sort of using their own perspectives to help sift through some of those themes, both within the work and the way that they're playing out in daily life. If you are on Zoom, I am dropping a link in the chat to that event. And yeah, so hopefully we'll see you there. And again, thank you everybody. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Grace. And I hope that you'll have a lovely Sunday.